All right, well, thank you so much for this introduction. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. This is actually my third Understanding Risk conference. I've been to a couple of international conferences in DC and London, so it's really nice to be here in Boulder and actually look at some of the local issues and some of the challenges that we are facing as a community. A big fan of this conferences. It's a lot of interesting people and a lot of expertise. So I am really here not just to share some of my work, but to learn from everybody who is going to be at this meeting. So the title of my talk is Understanding Population Risk to Weather Disasters, of course weather because we are at NCAR, in a changing climate. And so the couple of examples and some concept that I was going to present today, it's actually just an invitation for a conversation. It's a challenging issue and we don't have all the answers. We're trying to make progress in this area. And so I hope that through some of the presentations and panels, we can have some good productive discussions about the topics that I will mention today. So weather disasters have been a normal part of climate, normal part of human experience, but also, especially in the last decade or so, we've been experiencing, witnessing the fact that the climate and the society are co-evolving in a manner that can place more vulnerable people at risk from weather disasters. There's a lot of work that's been going on in this area in a disaster risk reduction community. The hazards field has a lot of scholarly work that's been addressing those issues. More recently, climate change adaptation field also have been proposing a lot of great concepts, great ideas. How do we start tackling issues of vulnerability, adaptation in this very dynamic environment? And so the work that we do really bridges some of those approaches. So we're taking some of the ideas and concepts from the hazards work, since we're dealing with hazards and vulnerability, resilience, and also looking at some of the adaptation work, that how do you adapt or how do you prepare for hazards and disasters in an environment that's constantly changing. So if we characterize risk, for example, as a probability of some negative outcome, be that a loss of life, some of the health outcomes, impact on livelihood, economic impacts, we could also view risk in a way that it's a product of a hazard, some physical phenomena, floods, droughts, hurricanes, heat waves, and vulnerability. And especially vulnerability in the climate change research is conceptualized as a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And so for us to really address this interplay of different physical and social dimensions in the disciplinary research, we have to take into account, different considerations, different knowledge from different disciplines. So we have to put together information about the weather and the climate, the existing variability, the trends, the changes that Lawrence mentioned. We need to know information about the built environment where people live, especially now that more than half of the world population lives in cities, natural environment and how that is changing due to different land use changes and other, human stressors. Population characteristics, and as well as social and behavioral processes. And I would say that understanding social and behavioral processes is probably by far the most challenging thing in this whole, kind of equation. We also need to understand that vulnerability is highly dynamic. Even if we do an assessment of risk of vulnerability at any given time, even a few days, a month, that type of analysis could be old, just because the social context and social landscape is changing constantly, as well as the environment. Scientists would like to understand things, so we do the understanding risk part, but we also work with stakeholders, trying to come up with solutions jointly, not only to understand risk, but reduce risk. And engagement of stakeholders at all levels is absolutely critical in this process, whether those are government organizations or decision makers or community members. Again, because we're dealing with this very highly dynamic phenomena, we have to think of some flexible and very adaptive strategies to how do we prepare for disasters, how we develop adaptation scenarios. And how do we be agile in the environment that's very, very challenging and dynamic? And going with the theme of the forum of a conference about the tech challenge, also we need to think of the tools. What kind of tools are critical for decision makers that could help them to make decisions and help communities to be more resilient? So in this presentation, I thought I would show you a couple of examples. One example is more Boulder specific, but it's not as developed as some other works that we do. And another example, is not a Colorado example, but again, if you're thinking about approaches, methodologies, tools, that's something that could be transferable to other locations. So I'll talk about the works that we've done on extreme heat in Houston, Texas. This was a large NASA-funded study that we undertook for several years. And I will also talk about the work that we started looking into about the flooding in Colorado, that you will hear a lot about this event in the next few days. But we will just talk about some elements of the risk that we thought would be interesting to explore. So we'll start with the heat. So this project that I'm mentioning, so we call it SIMMER. Have to, if you're a TEMCAR, you have to come up with acronyms for your projects. So a system for integrated modeling of metropolitan extreme heat risk. So the idea here was to really fully address this idea of, extreme heat vulnerability in present climate and in potentially future climate. Why are we concerned about heat? Extreme heat kills more people worldwide than any other weather-related hazard. So it's a big deal, especially in the urban areas where we have urban heat island effect, where we have highly diverse demographic fabric, very different living environments. People live in very different conditions, even in the cities that we think are highly developed. And so the goal for this project was to work on some methodologies, but also develop a system, SIMMER model, that would help to build local capacity and help to adapt to extreme heat in the public health sector. So the scale was regional, US, Southern Canada, and also Houston and Toronto, looking at a couple of examples from large North American cities. So first of all, when we start thinking about, risk, disasters, we have to come up with a conceptual idea, sort of a roadmap. How would we conceptualize different factors, and then how we can analyze also different phenomena that we're trying to study. So for extreme heat risk, we developed this framework, me and my colleague Mary Hayden, where we look at those factors that interact in a system, socio-ecological urban system, exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. We have external drivers such as climate change, population, different economic drivers that could affect some of the elements of the socio-ecological system. And on the other hand, we have adaptation and response strategies that can lessen vulnerability. And here we're really concerned with the impacts such as heat-related mortality and morbidity. And so every little bubble on this diagram has been represented either by quantitative data or by qualitative data. Some data come from computer models, some data from remote sensing observations, other data such as demographic characteristics we can get from census information. And so the idea is really to look at the intersection of all of those different factors that can help us explain risk at the neighborhood scale for the given population that live in that area. So again, so the data are very diverse, and one thing that I should say here, when you look at the adaptive capacity, so that's probably one of the more challenging data type to collect, because we don't have a good understanding and good readily available information on things like knowledge, attitude, practices that people have about a certain phenomena. We don't know about social capital, social networks. How do community come together in an event, such as extreme heat event, heat wave, floods, and other phenomena? And what types of programs exist, and what types of household resources may be available for people to better cope and adapt to some of those extreme events. And then based on this unique combination of factors, whether it's urban heat island, certain neighborhood characteristics, presence or absence of social capital, we can determine the relative risk of heat-related mortality and try to identify strategies that would be appropriate for that particular location. It could be education. In some cases, people are not aware of certain programs or they don't know symptoms of heat-related illness. But on the other hand, if people know exactly what to do, they just don't have resources to, cool themselves during heat event, then very different strategies and public health interventions have to happen. So different methods here, I'm not going to go through all of them, just to show you that it's a very interdisciplinary study, going from GIS to remote sensing to numerical modeling, looking at a lot of statistical analysis, and also using some quantitative and qualitative social science research, including surveys, focus groups, and the stakeholder workshops. And also the GIS, especially web-based technology, to produce tools for the public and decision makers. A couple of illustrations of the type of data that we're dealing with. So here's the city of Houston. And on those different panels, you can see different data representing urban heat island. You can see maps of heat health outcomes, which is there's no sort of really clear patterns, and that's what we really try and understand, what drives this heat-related mortality in different neighborhoods. We're looking at income, race and ethnicity, and also use of air conditioning, which of course in extreme heat is one of the adaptation strategies, but what, as we also found, perhaps may not be the most effective in all cases. And then at the end, we can produce things like relative risk of heat-related mortality, where we can see spatial patterns of where we can see higher risk, lower risk, and try to use that underlying data to understand how do we reduce that risk based on the research that we do on exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure plays a big role. We know that urban environment contributes to formation of urban heat islands, and in this study we also found that plays a major part in exposure to extreme heat. We found that relative risk of heat-related mortality was closely associated with a daily minimum temperature. That's something that's important for public health considerations. And also, if you look at changing exposure, when we look at the running computer models, the exposure is going to be increased. So by mid-century, we can expect more than half of summer nights in Houston to be qualified as high heat stress nights. So we developed this tool that you're welcome to look at. It's online. It's called Extreme Heat Climate Inspector. It's based on another tool that our program builds. It's called Climate Inspector. And actually that tool is published under the open source license. It's available on GitHub. So if anybody's interested in this type of technology, it's, we'd be happy to share the source code. But, kind of taking the results now from that study about the climate and how exposure can change, you can go online and you can click on different cities, different rural areas across the country, and estimate what kind of changes do we see in high heat stress days and high heat stress nights. And that type of information could be very helpful not only for public health personnel, but also for people who are concerned with energy, with architecture, with buildings. How do we create environments that could be resilient to those types of changes? Adaptive capacity, I mentioned, is an important part of this. And so we've done a number of things. We did a household survey asking people all kinds of questions related to adaptive capacity about their knowledge, attitude, risk perceptions, about how they interact with their neighbors, how do they get around, if they ever feel hot in their homes. So all of those kind of questions. And what we found is that there is different, multiple social and behavioral factors that interact to compound vulnerability. And including lack of social capital. And what we also found that some of the most vulnerable people, such as people as elderly, low income, socially isolated, those are the least likely to know about the neighborhood programs, government programs that exist, and take some protective actions during extreme heat events. They also have very little knowledge of symptoms of extreme heat. So again, risk communication, messaging, all of that information is extremely important. We also did a stakeholder survey asking them about their stakeholder perception about risk and how they think the risk may be changing in the future. And so most of our stakeholders were associating future risk with the growing number of vulnerable population. And again, so if you think about that, it may not be infrastructure type developments, but more emphasis could be placed on warning, on messaging, on education, on preparedness and response that could reach those that most vulnerable. And the types of tools that we built, I mentioned, I showed one for the regional kind of analysis, but also for the local level. So we built this GIS tools that basically shows which neighborhoods are hotter during the summer, which neighborhoods are cooler, and also where the cooling places are. Some designated cooling shelters versus just public air-conditioned building that people can use during an event. And that tool is also available online. So it was a really interesting project, and we learned a lot, and we feel like we're just scratching the surface, really, because this idea of adaptive capacity is really something that we're just starting to get a better understanding, and really understanding the role of different elements of adaptive capacity before disaster, during disaster, and also after an event. And so second project I was going to mention, so the Colorado Front Range floods that took place in 2013. And so in this project, my colleagues Lisa Dilling and Rebecca Morris, Lisa is with the University of Colorado and Western Water Assessment, and Rebecca is working here at NCAR. So what we wanted to there, instead of doing a big comprehensive analysis similar to what I presented about the heat, we just wanted to focus on one element of adaptive capacity and the knowledge and the risk perception that relates to surprise. So we wanted to know what were people were surprised about, and how do we take this information and learn about some of the ways to increase adaptive capacity in the future. So really, this type of project is looking at vulnerability, but in a high adaptive capacity context. Boulder, is probably one of the cities that was spend a lot of efforts to prepare for flooding. And yet, we had a very unprecedented event. And so we really wanted to tease out some of those elements of vulnerabilities that potentially could improve future preparedness. So this was a household survey. We surveyed about 100 people in Boulder, Lyons, Longmont, and Estes Park, which was done in collaboration with the Natural Hazards Center. And we asked people just 2 questions for this particular element of work. Were you surprised by anything, and what surprised you? So it kind of seems pretty simple, but we found a very interesting set of responses. Many responses were related to an event itself and exposure to that event. A lot of people were really surprised with the amount of rain that we had. Some quotes from people: "I have lived in Boulder County for over 30 years and have never seen anything close to this type of rainfall." Extent of flooding, just how many communities were affected. Nobody really expected something like this. Location of flooding. I thought Boulder flooding would be focused near the downtown area on Pearl Street, but it seemed to be much more damaging to residential areas of town. So again, just not quite understanding, the extent, geographic extent of this event. The source of flooding, so it wasn't just the rivers and canals, there was a lot of sewage backup and other types of flooding. And duration, how long the water kept streaming across our lands for 10 to 14 days after the flood. So this type of information, people were surprised about, and in a way it tells us something about that event was truly unprecedented, but it also tells us that, what do people know about, these types of phenomena and how they can be better prepared, and how that type of information can influence their risk perception and protective actions in future events. Adaptive capacity, there were also several surprises. Warning and information is the first one. We are not in a floodplain, and it was barely raining. There was no warning. So, and we hear that in all kinds of circumstances, whether it's floods, whether it's heat waves, whether it's hurricanes. No matter how much effort is spent on warning, there will be some segment of population that will say they did not receive any warning. And so how do you communicate some of those very important critical messages so they reach everybody? And especially in this case, people who were not in a floodplain, they thought they were perfectly safe. Insurance limits, of course, that was a huge one. No, not many people even understood who is insured, who is not insured, what is the grant, what is the loan, and how do you go about it. But of course, there were a lot of very positive surprises as well. The community support and the response of the different officials and construction crew, which talks about the existing infrastructure, the governance systems, but also the social capital that existed in the communities and the role of volunteers that helped to recover in this event. And of course, the transportation challenges as well, with a lot of mountain communities being cut off. So just lessons learned really quickly from this one, and it's very similar to the other hazards that we studied, such as heat. Lack of awareness of the full dimension of flooding. Again, people just don't quite think, it might be happening. Information products is the same thing like we talked about the heat. What types of appropriate warnings, advisories, products that would be relevant for different communities? Community relationship was extremely important in this case, as I mentioned before, and it's a very powerful form of adaptive capacity. And in case of the Colorado flooding, infrastructure in particular, which is considered a high adaptive capacity that connects different communities, in this case was shown as one of the vulnerabilities in the system. So it's something to consider for future. So, so what can we learn from those examples that seem kind of, different but similar? In one case, we have large city and, extreme heat events, not destructive, but still kills a lot of people. In this situation, it's, a lot of small towns. But the event was really unprecedented, very destructive. So, but, what we can, summarize is that really extreme weather events, when they interact with social vulnerable system, whether it's social system, ecological, infrastructure, they lead to disasters. And the way for us to better reduce those impacts is to better understand and characterize risk and vulnerability, especially at the scales that would be relevant for the communities and for decision makers. Again, I just wanted to emphasize it's such a critical component, not only in disaster preparedness, but in climate adaptation, is to understand adaptive and coping capacity of the communities, of the institutions, and how that not only lessens the current vulnerability, but how can we learn from those capacities to develop future adaptation strategies that may be, applicable for any given community. Even in a high adaptive capacity context, we have surprising vulnerabilities, and I think that's something that we don't quite have a very good understanding of. What surprised us that may be revealing some of the vulnerabilities that we just don't prepare for. But it's an opportunity for us to learn. And finally, again, looking at the vulnerability from the standpoint that it's a dynamic system, that we not only have changing climate, but we have changing social context and the societal landscape. That's extremely very important for understanding and reducing risk to weather disasters. So that's all I have, and welcome any questions, and here's my contact.
Thank you very much. We have some time for a few questions if anyone has any. Going once. Yes. You're
just one. How would you characterize extreme heat and wind? Cities can't really do much about it, so they may adapt, but it doesn't affect their neighbors. Unlike flooding, that if you put in structures to shed flooding from a city, it can greatly impact your neighbors, and then they have to deal with it on down the line. Is there any kind of categorizing of looking at natural disasters in that respect?
Yeah, I think what maybe it's a very good question, because I think, on one hand, you're also talking maybe about, risk transference, so maybe, you reduce vulnerability in one place, but you either, postpone the impacts until future, or maybe you increase vulnerability in another location. Is this kind of what you're talking about? So, and I think that's exactly what, we're trying to sort of bring up with this idea of, dynamics of vulnerability, and sometimes, preparing for just the climate variability, preparing for the current conditions, may not be sufficient for as, preparing for future climate change, because we may have, new disasters, or maybe you might have one highly adapted community in one place, but then the risk is really being transferred to another community. And so how do you look at it as a system? And how do you recognize, who are the players, what kind of, social interactions, what kind of natural interactions, what type of governance system that could, participate in risk reduction across all those different entities. I think that's very important, but I don't think we do that very well, just because, we often restricted by administrative boundaries or by just focusing on one event and not considering some other events. All right, well, thank you very much, and we can talk more.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Hi, everyone. I'm Simone Baylog, one of your other MCs, although, as you see, Greg just came in, so just on time. As I said, Simone Baylog, I'm the manager of the Understanding Risk community.